Hello, everybody, and welcome to Aspiring Partners. My guest today is Adrian Scrase, and I've known him for a very long time when he was at Etsy, and now he is very happily retired, and that gives him the opportunity to do whatever he wants. To say whatever he wants, and to work at University of Surrey as a professor, and he's doing consulting. He's very busy. And so very glad to have the opportunity to catch up with him and to hear what he thinks from his perspective in terms of the evolution of wireless, 5G, no, 4G, 5G, 6G. Since you've seen it all, what is it we can learn so that we move forward and avoid, what is it, not the mistakes, but maybe the disappointments that we had with previous technology, in previous new technologies. So, Adrian, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Monica, for inviting me.
So why don't you start telling us, you had a very, you spent long time in telecoms, you did a lot of great things, and you're still doing a lot of great things. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, in brief, my whole career was in telecoms, but the last 30 years of my career has been spent with inside a standards body. So I was a chief technical officer at Etsy for a couple of decades. So I viewed life very much from inside a standards body looking out. Now that I'm formally retired and I'm doing a bit of consultancy and I'm a visiting professor at Surrey, as you mentioned, but it gives me the opportunity of viewing life from the outside in, looking back into the standards bodies, perhaps being a little bit more objective and not being so sort of inward looking, being a bit more sort of externally looking and trying to see all the good things we got right and maybe some of the things that we didn't get right.
Absolutely. So maybe you can sort of give us sort of like your bird's eye view on the evolution, because as I say, you've seen it, and especially now that everybody's talking about 6G, it's become a very polarized topic where everybody's like, do we need it? Do we don't need it? Is it going to be another 5G? What's wrong if it's another 5G? You got everything out there. What do you think is it good? Is it bad? What should we do? Actually, and more importantly, what can we learn from what we've seen so far?
This is it's a well-told story, isn't it? And everybody talks about the successes of 2, 3G, 3G and 4G. And indeed, if you look at sort of the way society uses mobile connectivity these days, it really has changed our lives to the point that we are entirely dependent now on mobile devices. You cannot conceive leaving the house without having your phone in your pocket. So, on the one hand, I think we can really look back and say we have done a good job in at least enabling that which the whole of society has benefited from. But because we are engineers, we tend to beat ourselves up a little bit and look for the things that didn't go quite as planned. And when we got to 5G, I think it's fair to say that what came out of the end of the 5G experience was not quite what we expected. Personally, I was directly involved in the development of 5G standards, and I was convinced that from an engineering point of view, we had done a really good job. But when it came to deployment and market success, it wasn't at all as people expected. So here we are, sort of 5 years into the current generation, and we see quite different levels of deployment depending where you are in the world. In Asian circles, it's been deployed at pace. Some countries have extensively deployed 5G standalone. If you look in Europe, where you and I these days spend most of our time, many countries have yet to deploy the 5G standalone standard. So it's sort of a bit of a reflection, and I don't think we hit the market expectation quite as we should with 5G.
Yeah. Well, in some respect, if you look at some Asian countries, there's a lot of 5G because this started with less legacy. So the growth is higher because they started later. So maybe that's a simple fact. And then, there's nothing wrong with it where if you live in a place where there is already decent infrastructure, so the need to upgrade is not as high. Granted, 5G might be better, but it's not sufficiently better to justify a huge investment, especially if you can get more money from your subscribers. So
Yeah, I mean,
that
there are many reasons why
Mhm.
market success in Asia, the US, and Europe has materialized in different ways. There are different regulatory regimes. The economies of the operator basis there is quite different, of course. So it shouldn't be a surprise that deployment has gone the way that it did. But for some reason, it was a surprise, and maybe we should have been better prepared for that eventuality. But to me, the interesting bit is not looking so much looking backwards, but learning from those mistakes, looking forwards. What can we do about it next time to try and preempt what is likely to happen now with 6G deployment?
Yeah, because now there is this kind of like accepted wisdom that 5G was a failure, was bad, and I personally don't think that. I think it was our expectations were inflated, and therefore we were disappointed. But it's an expectation issue; it's not a technology issue. That's my personal
Yeah,
view. But the question is that what can we do to avoid it? Because if we fell into that trap once, are we gonna fall in that trap? And in fact, it was the same with 4G too. If we're it's like it just seems like a recurring situation. How can we get out of it?
I mean, to me, I think and I absolutely agree. I don't think 5G was bad, not at all. And I think what we did wrong, and I personally have to take some of the blame for this, is that we set the expectations too high, and we all got carried away with the marvelous use cases that the 5G technology would enable, without perhaps looking close enough at the market opportunity and the economics that lie behind that. And when I look back to 4G, I think we sort of under-promised and over-delivered. With 5G, we over-promised and under-delivered. So with 6G, we need to try and learn from both 4G and 5G experiences and say, well, let's not be quite so gung-ho about what 6G will do. Because I think we all got carried away with the 5G dream of, robotic surgery and autonomous cars. And I mean, these were great use cases, which the technology does enable. There just wasn't the market appetite or the economy that lies behind to say that it makes sense to deploy that technology in that way. So I think for me, the big lesson as we get towards sort of 6G completion is to make sure we just don't overpromise and underdeliver.
Yeah. And I guess also there is a question where, in a lot of, say, connected cars. I mean, there is clearly a lot of potential there. It's just that it takes longer than expected because there's all sorts of regulatory things with the fact that you have cars driving around that are not controlled by humans. But also, I think that we think that since we love the technology and technology is awesome, that since you can do all sorts of things, people will do and be willing to pay for it, which is not true. In fact, even I'm not going to be willing to pay huge amounts of money to do some virtual reality thing as I walk around the streets because I don't care. I mean, I see the beauty of it, but I don't see myself spending my time doing it. Some people do, but not everybody. So is there sort of a disconnect in terms of reading? Because as you say, we need the phone. We cannot survive without a phone. But what we really need the phone for, at least most of us, is it doesn't require a huge amount of, you need to have reliable connectivity and so on, but you don't need 5G for that. So,
Absolutely. And I mean, my own view here is that we know roughly how much is spent on academic research and development of technology, because we've got the figures are all available from our prime telecommunications providers. We know exactly how much is being spent, and it's a big number. Let's be clear. We spend a lot of money researching new technology. If only we spent a small fraction of that amount on the business case studies, I think that would be a really sensible thing to do. And in my university experiences recently, this is something I've been trying to push and say, well, what universities are actually studying the business cases that lie behind these technologies. I can speak from the experience at Surrey University, where I'm spending a bit of time these days, and it's become a precondition now of all funded activities that there must be a business case attached to the research results. So you can't just say this is something we can do with this technology. You must have an understanding how that technology will be deployed in real life and what are the expectations that it will actually be profitable. Otherwise, there's no point researching it. And this is, I think, a bit of a change that I would certainly try and promote in a wider scale. And I know we have competition rules that we need to be very clear about, and I'm not suggesting for one moment that we should breach any of the regulations on anti-competitive behaviour, but we do need to spend more effort, I think, within our prestigious telecommunications companies in understanding better how these technologies are going to generate revenue, not how they're going to be used, but what is the expected revenue stream that will come from that use. And that needs to be done objectively. We shouldn't be trying to convince people that what we're doing is right. It should be an objective assessment. And it probably shouldn't be done by engineers. And the standardization mechanism is driven by very, very clever engineers, but they're probably not the right people to actually assess the business opportunity that lies behind those technologies. So maybe I'm asking an awful lot, but I certainly think that it's something that's worth pursuing to see how we can get more connection between the technology evolution and the business success of those who adopt those technologies.
So I actually have my role in doing some of the business models. I don't actually do them now for most of the time for my living, but I've done it in the past. And in fact, I often get into trouble because they tend to be more conservative. But there is a lot. So I think that you're suggesting there should be more involvement from universities or independent institutions for the business model. It's a good one because you need someone that doesn't have a potential conflict of interest. So if you look at a lot of business models that they are done by the vendors who obviously, and it's not, they obviously have, well, what they're doing is that they build a business model that shows how their technology can be used to make money. That doesn't mean that applies to every operator. Then operators want to make money, so they try to think about it in that perspective. And then there are analysts or consulting companies, sort of like the McKinsey one, because I'm saying McKinsey because they tend to be usually more on the aggressive side that confirm it. So there is this kind of herd behavior in a way where everybody wants to see their new revenues. And they say that's the way you can do it, which is true. You can do it that way, but it's not realistically likely to happen. And so I think that we got into this circle. So I think it would be good to have somebody like universities doing it, where it can do it independently of those pressures.
And you would think that everybody in our ecosystem would really want to see those results, because if the result coming back is this is a great technology, we don't see how the hell you're going to make any money out of it, then whether you are a manufacturer of that product or an operator who is a potential customer of that product, you want to be aware of that. Of course, you can challenge the results and say, we think you got it wrong, and you could explain the errors of their ways. But I think everyone would want to have forewarning if they're about to invest a lot of money into something that studies say, we don't think you're going to make money out of this. So it's in all of our interests, I think. It's not apportioning blame or trying to point fingers in either direction. It's just common sense that we want to have good assessments before you spend a lot of money buying something to ensure that it is actually going to return your investment. And as I say, in 3G and 4G, we got it pretty much right. But in 5G, the wheels came off and we didn't get that right. So clearly there's something needs to change. If we do 6G in exactly the same way as we did 5G, we probably shouldn't be surprised at the result. So,
yeah. No, but if you remember, even with 4G, initially operators thought that they could just charge more for 4G, and that never went anywhere. 5G, they tried very briefly and they abandoned the idea. So, that's I think that, the way I personally see the business model is to say, if you want to make money out of it, this is the requirements. You need to be able to convince people to pay $10, €10 more per month. Then you make money. Is that
Mm-hmm.
realistic? So the business model, the financial model tells you that's the requirement. The question is that can you ask your subscribers, and that's a macroeconomic fact, it's not something that as an operator you control. I mean, and the other thing is that maybe there is too much competition in some countries, which explains why in the US, for instance, the ARPU is much higher. So do you think that since you're coming from the sort of that kind of, do you think that there's maybe too much competition?
Well, the competition is different, isn't it? And in the UK, we've just seen the number of
Mhm.
operators reduced by one, and we're waiting to see what will happen as a result of that. But if you compare the two extremes of, say, United States and of Europe, I mean the number of operators is completely different in Europe compared to the US, and it means that as an operator, you have enormous purchasing power, at least, because if you're one of the US big operators, then you decide on a particular vendor to supply your equipment. That's an enormous order. We see this all the time in the press, which means that when it comes to actually selecting technologies, maybe the larger operators in the US are listened to more than the smaller operators in regions like Europe. So it sort of reflects across the whole of our ecosystem, this diversity in the size and number of operators. But it's not something that we can correct very easily. We're not going to change the European regulatory landscape very easily and suddenly end up with 3 or 4 operators. That's just not going to happen. And I'm not even suggesting it would be a good thing to happen. But it does make things difficult because we have this disparity between the regions and the economic models of operators within those regions.
Yeah. Well, I think we need to, to think about it that way. But, I have phones in both countries, and I have to say that, in Europe, maybe the connectivity is not as good, but it's good enough, and I'm happy to pay less. And I'm working in the technology, and I think that a lot of people probably feel the same way, that even if, okay, it's not perfect, but it's cheaper. What's wrong with
Yeah,
that?
but the European regulatory approach has all been about getting the price down for the consumer.
Yeah.
That's been the big story in Europe. And I live most of my life in France these days, and half of my life, say, in the UK. But I'm a French mobile subscriber. I have a mobile subscription that gives me global roaming in 120 countries, and I've got unlimited data, and I pay €15 a month. And I think, well, you know what? It's worth an awful lot more to me than €15 a month, that service. So I think maybe we've undervalued. The pendulum has swung too far in favor of giving the best price to end consumers, because it then takes away the ability of those operators to invest more in new technologies, because the revenue streams, are such that by the time they've paid their operational expenses, there's not an awful lot left, particularly given the big changes with energy costs. But so personally, I sort of think maybe we've undervalued our product. The pendulum has swung too far, and
Yeah.
of course, if you want to increase prices, the consumer will want to see better connectivity, which is a whole different discussion for us to have. But if you can provide compelling connectivity, then maybe that is something that consumers would be prepared to pay more for, because you're absolutely right. In certain European geographies, the 5G connectivity is not particularly good at all. If there is any connectivity, you spend half your life on sort of 4G. But so yeah, focus on getting the connectivity right and increasing the value for end consumers, and then maybe you can charge more money for it. Personally, I would be happy to pay
Yeah.
more than I pay now, because for me it's worth more.
Yeah. I mean, even if it stays the same quality, but I guess that the issue is that, and maybe it's not a regulatory issue, but it's a competitive, I mean, the way the operators behave is in competing with each other so hard. I mean, it kind of like lower the prices for everybody, because even now, if you have one operator, And there are some that have a better network, charge a little bit more, but they don't see people going to them because they say, well, you know, as long as it's good enough, it's good enough. They don't particularly
Mm-hmm.
seem to care. So we, and I guess that's the kind of thing that we need to sort of look from a technology point of view. Technology is awesome, but maybe we underprice the service, but we also think that the updates, the improvements are valuable more than we think they are, which is what happened, I guess, with 5G. But I wanted to ask you something about sensing, because the question is that obviously, you know, we need to think about if we deploy this new technology, are we going to get money? Sensing is an interesting case because you actually use the infrastructure you have to run something else on top. So from that perspective, it's not entirely clear what the revenues come from, but at least doesn't seem like you have a huge capex that is required to support it. So what's your view on that?
Well, from an engineering point of view, I think sensing is probably one of, if not the most important of the new use cases that will come out with 6G. You know, I'm convinced that there are unlimited possibilities to exploit the sensing capability. And as you say, it's not going to be hugely expensive to do that. But again, I'm still lacking the where does the money come from? Where's the revenue stream possibilities here? And that's where I think we should look to have more of these studies that I was alluding to earlier to see, well, you know, if we are going to use this to generate revenue, you need to do something for end users that will actually be prepared to pay for that. But the possibilities are huge with sensing, absolutely huge. It's just a matter of how we package it. There are regulatory issues, of course, with sensing, which will need to be addressed. But personally, I really think that sensing is one of the bright lights of the future. We just need to understand how we're going to do that and how we can make it a business success.
Yeah, you know, when I talk about sensing to people, well, first of all, few people even understand what that is. I mean, the basics, really, you know, but then to sort of understand how to use it. I mean, I think it was similar when, you know, when we start having video, uh, you know, I don't know about you, but I thought, well, who wants to do video? I mean, this is like, that's terrible. I don't like to be on video. Nobody wants to do it. I didn't really see any use case. I mean, yes, yeah, but and I was completely wrong. And I think that with the sensing is going to be the same thing because we're like, well, yeah, okay, you know, but what's the point of what is it you can do? So um, I think that that might be something that as you see it working, just like, oh yes, we can do this, this, and this. But is there some use case that you think is going to be more promising or more interesting?
If you consider sensing as sort of RFID on steroids, that sort of approach,
Mhm.
where
Yeah.
you have an RFD-like capability without having to install another network because you already have the connectivity
Yes.
mechanism
Mhm.
there, then there are, say, unlimited use cases, particularly for asset tracking, for stock control. It could be for auto tolling on motorways. You know, the ability to sense objects wherever they are in the network, particularly where that sensing takes place at either zero or close to zero energy consumption by the device itself, because it's all done by harvesting. You know, the possibilities are sort of unlimited, I think, if we get it
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. No, I think, yeah, I see that it's just going to be, it's just going to take time, however. And I think that like with everything, if you think, you know, what's going to happen in the next 5 years, probably not a whole lot because we need to understand how to use it. We need to make sure that it's sufficiently reliable. So those are kind of things that actually take time. It's not.
But I mean, this is coming back to where we started at the beginning of our chat about getting the expectations right. And as we've gone from generation to generation, we've given the impression that all of the capabilities that a generation will enable will be available on day one. And we've never corrected that vision. And I think that's what we need to do. So now I know even within standardization circles, they're talking about the day one experience, because 2030, when the 6G standard is all published and out there and being deployed, you're not going to have all of the advanced capabilities that technology will enable on day one. It's what we're seeing in 5G, isn't it? Some of the 5G expectation is only starting to emerge now, 5 years after the standard was published. And we mustn't be surprised by that. So you're absolutely right. I mean, sensing has a huge future, but it may not necessarily be tomorrow. It could take some time to even appreciate the capabilities of sensing, and for industry at large to sort of understand that capability is there, and then for clever people to decide how to exploit it and make money.
Yeah. No, and that's clearly an issue. So what kind of timeline should we expect? Because again, 5G, we're just in the middle of deploying it. So, clearly there is some, well, we still have 2G networks. So, clearly every technology keeps progressing or staying around. So what kind of timeline do you foresee for 6G? That's sort of realistic, like in our
I mean,
mindset.
the formal timeline is very well known and it's published
Yeah.
out there, and I've had discussions in many circles about, why don't we just delay 6G by another 5 years? We don't need it now. Let's have it in 2035, which sort of
Yeah.
sounds, actually, it sounds
Yeah, I don't know.
sort of a common sense thing to do. If we don't need it
Yeah.
in 2030, why don't we have it in 2035? But that is unrealistic, because the decision-making mechanism that lies behind generations is really within the hands of governments. It's the ITU, the sector member, the administrations in the ITU that rubber stamp the timeline. That timeline was already agreed many years ago, and it's not going to change. At the end of 2030, the ink will be dry on the standards, and that will be published as IMT 2030. And honestly, the ability to change that, unless there was an enormous groundswell of opinion that says the timeline is wrong, it's not going to change. And you won't get that groundswell, because actually, for, as we said, for, say, Asian market, that timeline is absolutely fine. But if you look in a little bit more detail, the content of the 6G standard day one will need to be firming up at the end of 2029. That will then give a few months for correcting any errors, doing bug fixes. But end of 2029, that's really only 4 years' time, realistically. So you've got 4 years then to agree what is going to be the content of the next standard. So we shouldn't be expecting a big bang, to be honest, because with only 4 years to go to study, evaluate, select, and standardize, that doesn't give you time to do earth-shattering changes. And I think the world at large has said we don't need earth-shattering changes. So the content of what you and I will call 6G will be firming up around the end of 2029. Standards will then be published, coming out as the IMT 2030 package at the end of 2030. So earliest deployment, if what happened with 5G repeats itself, you will see the earliest deployments at the beginning of 2030, 2031 will be the earliest sort of deployments. Quite what they will look like is probably too early to say. But realistically, it will be another 12 months before you see the early adopters moving in there at pace and deploying a 6G standard. If the current situation with 5G continues, where you still have a number of countries that haven't deployed 5G standalone by that time, then I guess they will have the opportunity to leapfrog mainly to 6G, which could be an option. The pace of deployment of 5G has sort of tailed off a little bit. It started off at pace, but I think people now are looking and saying, well, what will 6G provide? Should we wait for 6G? I mean, personally, I've never thought that's a particularly good idea, because you don't actually know what 6G is going to be yet. So, you're putting your faith into something that's unknown. But I don't think the timeline is going to shift. So I think standards completion by the end of 2030, first deployments 2031.
But isn't that at the end, it's like, well, that's fine if you don't think of the whole evolution of technology based on a G, on the new G. So if you think of it like more as a gradual incremental process, whether you call it 5G advanced or 6G or 7G or whatever, who cares? I mean, clearly technology has to move forward, but it moves forward anyway. And at some point, if you just agree that as an industry we have a new G every X years, well, fine. I guess that the part of the problem is that we get so fixated with 5G, 6G, or whatever, instead of saying, okay, I have a network, or I need some better functionality, I need something else, I need something better. I'm going to deploy it based on what's available. So if we don't, I think that part of the problem is that you get too stuck onto the G's instead of what is that I need? What is it I can make money of? What is it I can afford paying? You know,
I mean, that's
do you
absolutely
think that
true. And
that's a problem?
it's absolutely true. Industry doesn't deploy generations, they deploy 3GPP releases.
Yeah.
So if we want to talk about the current status, most operators have deployed 3GPP release 15. Those with standalone have deployed 3GPP release 16. But if you want to have new capabilities, you don't have to wait for a new generation. You could deploy release 17 and release 18, which collectively have a huge number of improvements within it. So you could almost take the G wrapper and do away with the G wrapper if you don't want it, and just talk about 3GPP releases. And I know there is a number of people who I have some respect for who say let's just get rid of this G stuff and we only have releases. I can counter argue why having Gs is a good idea, but from a conceptual point of view, you don't actually need that G classification because industry will deploy 3GPP releases. And if you want the functionality
No.
that's contained in 3GPP release 18, you deploy release 18 in your network. And if you want to deploy sensing, you shouldn't have to wait. You don't have to wait for a whole generation to do that. The generational change historically has only really been the switch point where the air interface has changed. So if you want to have one thing that characterizes a generation, historically it's been a new radio interface and in some cases a new core network. I mean, arguably, you don't have to wait for a generation to change the air interface either. If a great new technology came up, say in 2032 or 2033, we're not going to wait till 2040 to deploy it in what will be 7G, and we're not obliged to do that. So maybe we do put too much emphasis onto the G wrapper, and removing that G, or talking less about the G wrapper and talking more about 3GPP releases could be a way forward. And to counter argue my point, I've always thought generations have certain value because governments tend to understand generations. People who provide big money for R&D tend to understand generations. It's hard to convince a government to invest in 3GPP release 29 or whatever we want to call it, but you get more understanding, you get more attraction if you start talking about a generation. But that's just for historic reasons. There's no reason why in the future we couldn't just do away with that. You're not obliged to have
Well,
the
and I think that
generation.
there's nothing wrong with it, because it's kind of gives you kind of a roadmap, a way to organize things. So it's perfectly fine. It's just that you shouldn't be so dependent that the whole thing collapses because you don't think that 5G is good enough. But I wanted to ask you, our time is up, but I wanted to ask you a final question that I hear a lot of people say, well, 5G had too many things, too many options, too complicated. We don't need all of that. And my personal view is like, well, you don't have, I mean, the standard gives you possibilities to do all sorts of things, and then you take whatever. And so it's actually good to have more of a choice because it's kind of like sensitive. You have sensing, you don't know exactly how good, how widely it's going to be deployed, but it's good to have because it gives you the opportunity to do so. If it doesn't, well, whatever, we tried. So I think that uh, I don't know, but probably a large percentage of everything that is 5G hardly gets deployed. But what's wrong with that? So do you think
I mean,
it's
this
just
is,
too much? We have, like 6G should be more sort of condensed and focus only on the things that we think now will be relevant?
I mean, this is a very topical discussion and one I've been involved in for many years, and I continue to be involved in this exact discussion. Should we have more scrutiny at the start of work, and only standardize a minimum set of features that we believe have prospects of being deployed? But very hard to do that. Very hard indeed. Honestly, at the beginning of starting a new feature, you don't really know whether it's going to be successful or not. And if we look historically, things like the big cases like SMS, for example, that SMS didn't have any attraction when it was first standardized. And look, you can't imagine life without SMS now. So it's very difficult to pick the winners. If you try and pick the winners, you can get into real trouble from a competition point of view. Who are you to say that somebody's bright idea is not going to be a market success? Maybe they know something you don't. And why should they have to release all of their commercial plans when maybe they've hooked onto a really great idea? So it's a nice objective to say we reduce the number of features, but in reality, it's much harder to do that. Of course, the consequence is that if you have a huge package of releases, the amount of committee time required to develop them all in standards is huge. And of course, we don't want to waste our time writing features that never get deployed. So I sort of think we need to be somewhere in the middle of all of this. We need to have perhaps a bit more scrutiny, but not so much scrutiny that we stifle innovation, because as you rightly say, the role of standards bodies is to create opportunity. And to create opportunity, you cannot pick the winners from day one. Maybe there is scope to say, well, if you want to enhance a feature which hasn't already been deployed, then maybe that's where you start to get more scrutiny and say, well, there's no evidence that this feature is actually being commercially deployed. So why should we spend more time enhancing that feature? But again, that's dangerous, because maybe the reason why it hasn't been deployed initially is because there's a critical piece missing, which the enhancement will provide. So it's a healthy debate to have, but it isn't as simple as saying let's reduce the number of features within a standard. We mustn't confuse this, though, with options in standards, because options in standards is perhaps what led us to where we are in 5G right now, where architecturally you have different ways to deploy technology. And once you go down that route, then fragmentation is one step away. So that's slightly different than saying let's limit the number of features we develop, and that shouldn't be confused with options in standards.
Well, but at the same time, you could have fragmentation, because if you don't support the options, then people might just go the proprietary way, which is even worse. So I guess,
Absolutely.
as I say,
And
really,
that's
you can't really win. I mean, you just can use good judgment, but there is no prescriptive way. Keep it limited, It's
Yeah, I
not
mean,
that easy.
your good judgment and my good judgment could end up with a
It's
different
different.
result. That's the problem, And you're absolutely
Well,
right. If you drive work out of standards bodies because you reject, you will see it appear as a proprietary solution. And is it better to
not better.
have people in the camp developing the standards, even if perhaps it generates lots more features than you want, or you end up feeding a proprietary mechanism externally, and then eventually you end up with that proprietary mechanism, if it is a market success, being forced back into the standards body. And we've got good examples historically of this, and it's painful. So in summary, I think I promote the continuation of an open, transparent mechanism where technology is evaluated on its merit. And yeah, if we can strip out stuff that we honestly think is going to be a market failure, then fine, but easier to say than it is to do, really.
Well, and as I say, you need to have the business model, but the business model is not going to be done, or it is not, and it should not, I would say, be done by the engineers developing technology, because that's not their job, really. And since you don't know that ahead of time, you need to leave the options open, and then you have the business model and say, is this going to, but if you don't know what it does, if you don't know what it costs, how do
Yeah,
you know? You cannot do the business model before you develop a technology. So,
indeed. That's
anyway, Adrian, thank you so much. I think we should go and keep when we get closer to 6G to see here's what we learn really being used to improve things or not, because I think it's a big question open at this point.
Yeah,
So
I'd be
Adrian,
happy
thank
to
you
do
so
that.
much. Thank you so much.
Thank
It
you,
was a
Monica.
pleasure as always. And thank you all for listening in. And as you know, do listen to the other Sparring Partners on your favorite platform and tell others about it if you like it. Thank you so much.